my talk with a few quotes from past and present political leaders. And the first one, I think, is a very good one, really. What really shapes the future of anything? Very rarely plans, political plans, but events, dear boy, events. In the case of my first theme, it's perhaps more accurate to call it millions of little events around the world. I think one of the things we all know is going to shape the future of the industry is the changing demographics of the world. We all know about increasing longevity and the fact that people are living longer and longer. But I think the statistics are worth a quick look. 1 in 9 people in the world are already over 60. By 2050, that will be 1 in 5. By 2050, 64 countries will have nearly 1 in 3 people over the age of 60. And the one that really struck me, 1/3 of 2012 babies in the UK are expected to reach 100. The flip side of the demographic coin, of course, is also that the birth rates and the dependency ratios are not keeping up with all this. So we've got an ageing population which suggests a need for more pension provision, but other demographics suggesting as well that those are not going to be pay-as-you-go schemes, but funded pension provision, growing throughout the world. Demographics, of course, covers a lot of other things, and there could be some curveballs thrown our way that we don't necessarily expect. We tend to focus on longevity, birth rates, and so on. But there are other factors such as immigration and emigration. And this survey caught my eye recently, a survey of the reaction of young professionals to a series of pieces of advice put to them by older professionals. And 30% of the young professionals responding said they would move abroad to improve their life prospects, and a further 36% said they would at least consider it. Another theme that, of course, is going to have a huge impact on the industry, on asset allocations and pension schemes, is economics. The global credit crunch, we've been through extraordinary economic times recently, in the last 5 years. The global credit crunch is estimated by the IMF to have cost governments worldwide $10 trillion in support. Not all of it immediate, some of it in the form of guarantees and the like, but nonetheless staggering figures. The figures for quantitative easing to September 2012 there are also quite extraordinary. £375 billion from the Bank of England and $2.3 trillion from the Fed, which of course has also had very obvious knock-on effects in the world of pension schemes. We've seen as part of the fallout from the credit crunch, the sovereign debt crisis, and different governments struggling to borrow at different degrees of difficulty in financing themselves, and the euro crisis. And we're living in a world of continuing economic uncertainty at the moment. Talking of the euro crisis, I just had to include this quote, which I rather like. "I want the whole of Europe to have one currency. It will make trading much easier." What I like about this quote is who said it and when. Bonaparte in 1807. I think his plans for a single currency didn't end that well, did they? What about politics? Well, Labour announced last week a policy of capping pensions fees, of course. They said they were going to launch an attack on vested interests and cosy cartels. Obviously a comment of no relevance to the current audience. Predistribution is a theme for them, and so is attacking inequality. So an awful lot could come out of that when they actually start to formulate that into policies that could in turn have knock-on impacts on the pensions industry and how it operates. In the interest of political neutrality, I should say I haven't included any slides on what the Conservatives would do if they formed the next government of the United Kingdom, because I prepared the slides last week, and I haven't added anything about what the Liberal Democrats would do if they formed the next government, because of time constraints. I am a lawyer. This is my cheap laugh slide, so you're allowed to have a laugh. I think we can just about scrape in Henry VI as a political leader. But what influence will law and regulation have on the future of the industry? Well, let's talk a little bit about defined benefits first, and the influence that I think we can see here of the regulator, the pensions regulator. Mainly this operates through the scheme-specific funding regime, which has been in place since 30th December 2003, with a specific requirement for DB scheme trustees to choose actuarial assumptions prudently, and with an emphasis on the level of risk that can be accepted given the strength of the employer covenant. In the valuation sphere, that's led to a certain pressure on discount rates for trustees. But in the background, there's also been some pressure from the regulator on trustees to invest prudently. Questions being asked of trustees: you assess your covenant risk as weak, strong, whatever. Do you actually think, given your covenant, that you can afford the investment risk that you're currently carrying in your strategy? And I think the regulator has had some influence in the background on asset allocation. As a lawyer, I find this quite interesting, actually, because the regulator has no direct regulatory powers in relation to investments. So it's very much a case of sort of influence in the background. We've also seen some influencing moves from the Pension Protection Fund. For example, the introduction in 2012 of investment risk as a factor in the calculation of the PPF's risk-based levy. And in recent transactions, perhaps a sense that the regulator and the PPF are less willing to countenance schemes with little or no sponsor support, running on, carrying any investment risk at the potential expense of the PPF. And situations such as Polestar and BMI tend to support that. Are schemes reacting to this? Well, it's not only the regulatory influences that have this effect, I mean, it is a worldwide phenomenon. A recent OECD survey suggested that allocations in pension schemes worldwide to public equities fell to an all-time low in 2011. But I thought these two pie charts were quite interesting because they do show the drift between 2006 and 2011 to, generally speaking, lower risk assets, perhaps a sprinkling of alternatives there in the other category. And there are other signs too. Inflation hedging, for example, reached a record 18.5 billion in the second quarter of 2012, and longevity hedging is at least being thought about by a large number of schemes, even if to date the actual implementation of longevity hedging has been relatively limited. And finally, on the DB front, of course, we have Solvency II and some sort of application of Solvency II to pension funds to come. I'm not going to talk about that in detail because really the detail of how that's going to work hasn't completely been worked out. But I think we can assume that it's likely to be another regulatory pressure in the de-risking direction. We might just be starting to see some rowback on that regulatory pressure, though. Michael O'Higgins, the pensions regulator chairman, was quoted in the pensions press last week as saying legislation does not require trustees to invest in gilts. The regulator does not require a risk-free approach. And indeed, we do not want trustees to be recklessly prudent. So perhaps there's some regulatory rowing back on that direction of travel. Finally, the other area I wanted to talk about really was the growth of DC, which I think is partly a response to regulation. I mean, employers are moving from DB to DC partly because of things like those longevity risks we talked about, and DB promises becoming more expensive. But I think to some extent DC is also seen as a less onerous regulatory environment. And again, the statistics back this up. 30% of employees are in DB schemes now, down from 46% in '97. DC schemes have correspondingly gone up. By my reckoning, that means there's 54% of the employee workforce to go. And of course, the regulatory response to that is the introduction of auto-enrolment from this October. And that's massive. That's potentially massive amounts of new money coming into funded DC pension schemes. So what shaping influence will the regulator or the laws have on DC? Well, the regulator has, of course, published his 6 principles for good DC governance. They are set out there. Schemes should be durable, fair, and produce good outcomes, have good governance systems in place, effective governance and monitoring throughout their lifetime, be well administered, and produce communications that are clear and transparent and effectively enable informed member decisions. And they've backed that up with key features. The 6 principles are backed up with key features from the regulators, which are quite extensive. There's some key themes in that are about value for money, costs and charges being fair and transparent, and above all, the ongoing suitability of the default strategy and of the investment choices offered. Procedures should be in place to monitor the appropriateness of investments. Schemes should continue to meet essential characteristics, including appropriate management of risks. If the regulator gets what he wants, therefore, we should see much greater activism in the DC sphere with a focus on asset allocation, much tighter focus perhaps on manager performance, and focus too on the efficient not necessarily transitions when investment strategy or a manager changes, but that are actually part of the investment strategy, like transitions within lifestyling products. How effective will it be? I think there are internal tensions in the key factors. All of these good things on the investment front tend to come at a cost. The pressure on costs could mitigate against much activism on the investment front. I think it's very difficult. I think it's also very difficult. We see that the vast majority of DC contributors at the moment are in personal pension schemes, where providers with the best will in the world are not necessarily in the best place to provide that kind of ongoing monitoring of suitability. I would speculate, really, that this may be the area in which the law will again start to move. In relation to the DWP guidance on default investments, the DWP have a little paragraph at the end suggesting if they don't get the desired results, they will legislate. And indeed, in early 2012, the DWP announced its inquiry into workplace DC governance. So my speculation would be that we could see regulation in the non-occupational, in the contract-based DC scheme space. Finally, I am a lawyer, so I couldn't leave you without a disclaimer to say that you must take care in relying on anything I've said this afternoon. But I thought I'd phrase that in the words of that great master of political speech, Donald Rumsfeld.